everybody. So I've got about 20 minutes here. I'm going to go through this discussion rather quickly. One of the things that in my previous role at Deloitte, I was a partner there leading the innovation practice with Andrew Vaz, who's the Chief Innovation Officer. Deloitte set up a program called the Innovation Partnership Program with Singularity University and Xprize. We established it about 3 years ago. And the reason I bring this up is because over those 3 years, we had 30 of the largest companies in the world, all Fortune 500 corporations, mostly Fortune 200 corporations, get together in a membership model where we'd bring them out to Singularity University or Xprize headquarters out on the West Coast and spend 3 or 4 days with executive teams, literally the senior leaders of these major organizations, 3 or 4 days, so not just a few hours, essentially doing a deep dive in what you guys are getting exposed to in the last couple of days. But imagine if you were here with your executive teams in a room that you didn't compete with anybody. There's no competitors in the same room there. And it was like an anthropological exercise because it was very interesting to me. I've been doing work in industry for a long time. I've been doing work in consulting a long time. I haven't seen a movement like this come along in some great while, where companies really started to realize that their next 10 years, the level of disruption that could take place, as well as the level of opportunity that they could capture, was significant. And from my vantage point, you could almost see which industries were moving faster than others. Because after looking at 3 years, we had representatives from every single industry. You started to see which industries were moving forward faster than others. And more importantly, within each industry, you saw certain companies that were moving forward while everybody else wasn't paying attention. So whether you know it or not, there is a level of disruptive advantage that's starting to take place right now. I can tell you that if you're not the one who's focused on this, someone in your industry is actually really behind the scenes, somewhat covertly, really getting into this space very quickly. The thing that we talk about at the Innovation Partnership Program is disrupt yourself before you get disrupted. We recoined this, Uber yourself before you get Kodaked. The notion is disruptive advantage instead of competitive advantage. So instead of trying to do 10% improvement, go for 10 times improvement. If you look at certain organizations like Google with Astro Teller, who runs the Google X program, now it's called X, he comes and talks at the Innovation Partnership Program, and he discusses this notion of legitimately creating a culture where you are trying to go 10 times better, not 10%, because to go 10 times better, it doesn't take 10 times smarter people, it doesn't take 10 times more people, it doesn't take 10 times the amount of investment, but it's 10 times better. So the economics really pay off. And then the last notion is the pace and magnitude of change and who can create that change. So the fact that we're surrounded by a world of entrepreneurs that are really creating new ecosystems, that are creating a level of innovation we just haven't seen before. I heard the last question about how do you get your kids into this space. I have 2 kids. One, my son's in college and my daughter's graduated college last year. First thing I'm doing, my son, he literally came back yesterday from his sophomore year. I got him an internship in the most rugged, startup I could find in the West Coast. And I said, he'll work for food. It's like he doesn't even need to be paid. It's just get them out there in the community, because there's a level of entrepreneurial renaissance going on that if your kids don't get that bug, they're not going to get it, and they're going to get outcompeted by those that are getting into that ecosystem. A lot of the discussion that you heard yesterday was on the left: AI, robotics, 3D printing, virtual reality, augmented reality. It was somewhat technology innovation focused. What I'm going to share with you is a little bit more on the organization and process side. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the future of the firm, particularly in this time and this date and this age, with everyone being connected to the internet with supercomputers in the pockets. You have this crowd phenomena that's happening, which you have a labor force that goes way beyond your 4 walls as an organization. If you haven't been paying attention to the crowd movement, you're not designing an exponential organization, you're not designing for the future. I will tell you too, in all the work that I had been doing at Deloitte, one of the areas that companies were moving forward on immediately was using the crowd, and we'll talk about why. So there's some real practical stuff here. In terms of industrialized crowdsourcing, think about this. What if you could get access to anyone, anywhere in the world, any time of day, and at the scale that you need? Okay? And think about that scale question, because as you as manufacturers learn about new technologies, new innovations, new breakthroughs here, if any of you are in the HR side and you're thinking about the labor that your organization needs, how are you going to start to staff up around some of these technologies, this innovation, realizing that it might be the Betamax version, not the VHS version. You know what I mean? The dust hasn't settled yet. You still don't know which direction things are going to go. So if you're building a staff and a skill set and a talent model, you can't hire people, train them, and then find out 2 years later that your first mover advantage actually backfired on you, and now you have a bunch of resources because the technology's gone a completely different way, you know, to solve some solution or to solve something you were focused on. Having scale on demand is very important in that model, to be able to scale the expertise when you need it. If it has a long shelf life, great, but if it has a short shelf life, you don't have to lay everybody off. You can scale back and scale up, and that's very important from having that adaptable and agile framework. And this is not just simple tasks, but you can crowdsource people around the world to do very complex things and very open-ended things. And the reason why we're seeing this happen now versus we weren't talking about this even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is because this trend that's happening where you've got cloud internet computing, you've got mobile devices, the world's walking around with supercomputers in their pockets. And then also keep in mind the social aspect. People, especially millennials, especially my kids, they're more used to collaborating with people that they don't work in the same four walls with. They're growing up this way. You know, from college, they're organizing events or parties or research projects or whatever with people from other universities, let alone from their own university. So they're getting wired in a way to think like, I can do this from a coffee shop. I don't need to sit in a room or in an office or in a department with people. And that's very important. So the new workforce is growing up this way. You also have to keep in mind that this is the predominant workforce now. The millennials are the largest portion of the workforce in the US, okay? So you have one other trend that's happening, which is with the delineation between current economics conditions is creating an interesting scenario where you have one group of people worldwide, but also in certain communities, that have too much money and not enough time. And you have another group that has not enough money and too much time. It relates a little bit to the inequality in income discussion. But think about this. When you have one group of people in the world that has lack of access to investment, to resources, to money, to capital, but they have a lot of time, they're unemployed, and you have this other group that has access to capital, investment, time, and has not enough time to get things done, these groups are connecting with each other, and it can be anywhere in the world, and you're starting to see that happen. So you can tap into someone's brain on the other side of the planet to do something for you. It could be a labor task, it could be an intellectual task. The kicker on all this is we're at what I call the dot matrix version of using the crowd. So the notion of using brains outside of your departments and looking at the brains and the wisdom of the world or the genius of the crowd worldwide, you got to keep in mind that right now we're at about 3 billion people in 2016 that have access to the internet. It's roughly 3 billion people. We have a lot of projects that are happening that are underway that you heard talked about in the last couple of days. You've got the Google Loon project. You've got the Facebook drone project that Mark Zuckerberg's working on. You have all these efforts that are underway to give everybody on the planet access to the internet, in many cases for free, and super speed access to the internet. So it's very realistic to think that in the next 5 to 10 years, I think 10 years is on the maximum end, in the next 5 to 10 years, the experts are saying, we will have free Wi-Fi for everybody on the planet, or everybody will have access. So that's going from 3 billion people to a planet in 5, 10 years of 7 to 8 billion people that have access to the internet. So think about all these minds that are now connected. If you don't have a strategy to tap into that wisdom, to leverage all those minds across the world, you're going to lose against those that have that strategy. And we'll talk more about this. So who are the crowds? You know, first of all, when we talk about a crowd, it could be external crowds. These could be your consumers. These could be communities of interest, affinity groups, scientific communities, or it could just be the population at large. That's a crowd. You also have internal crowds. Many of you in here have organizations that have hundreds of thousands of people in them. So you have your own untapped crowd just in your own organization. So when you hear about these crowd strategies, which is a way to capture excess capacity, you can use it you can use it without going even outside your organization. You can just harness the wisdom of your entire crowd within your own organization. And these are one and the same. Make no mistake about it that you have people in your organization today that on nights and weekends, or perhaps even during the day when they're working for you, they're on the web starting to play in these crowd models. It's a given, I would say especially the younger generation that understands how these models work. Nights and weekends, they're out there, they have data scientist skills, they can code things, they're creative people, whatever they're doing, they can participate in these models and start making income outside of your organization. These are rather sophisticated groups. Sometimes people think that, you know what, these crowd models are all the people in the world that don't have regular jobs or can't get jobs. That's actually not the case. Like I said, many of them are people that are working for you. Okay? They're just competing on these crowd platforms on nights and weekends. Very well educated. The interesting thing is what we're seeing is some of the more prominent crowdsourcing sites where you can crowdsource data scientists from around the world, or developers from around the world, coders, or creatives from around the world to make your next commercial. We're finding out that if you're really, really talented, so you graduate top of your class and you're just the best developer in your class, we're finding that out of school, you can start to play in these crowd models. And I know a few of these individuals. They're that good that they get into these models. They don't go searching for any job. They get into these models, and they're making 7 figures out of school because they can just quickly win. A lot of them are competition-based. They just clean house. They just go into all these crowd sites, and there's dozens of them that they can go on and just print money all day because they're that good. And so you're finding that some of the best people in the world are going into these crowd models, which you can take advantage of. Now, it's important to understand why this is actually a superior model. This shouldn't be a plan B. This should start to be your plan A. The reason being is that, does anyone in this room think that the smartest people in the world work in your company? Nobody? So the smartest people in the world don't work in our companies because there's 7 billion people plus on the planet. The smartest people in the world have to be somewhere out there in the crowd, right? So if you start to compete against a company that's using the genius of the crowd or the wisdom of the world, you're going to put yourself in a competition, a smartness competition with everybody else in the world, and you're going to lose. Does that make sense? If you don't use the crowd and tap that wisdom of the crowd, and you like to use the minds in your 4 walls, by definition, those are not the smartest minds in the world. They are somewhere out there in the 8 billion people on the planet. And if you can tap into that, if your competitors can tap into that, you're going to lose in that race, in that talent race. The trick is, granted, the smartest people in the world are somewhere out there in the crowd, but what makes me think that they're going to work for me on my problems and my company's challenges or issues? And that's where if you start to break down these models, you start to see the type of incentive structure in which these crowd platforms work. You've got one is compensation. You can pay people and they'll compete, they'll work for you regardless of where they are in the world, regardless of what time of day it is, right? Compensation is a big incentive. You also can make things very convenient. Something we've seen kind of in the consumer products retail space is gig walk. Many of you are probably familiar with this because it's kind of a play on this industry. Gig walk is giving your son or daughter an app that when they walk into a grocery store, it prompts them and says, you're in a grocery store. We can tell from the GPS on the phone, if you go take a picture of the cereal aisle or the display or the price point, we'll give you $4 in your PayPal account immediately. It's just convenient. So my daughter was using this app and making $100 a week just by doing her normal day occurrences, and next thing you know, someone wants a picture of the menu in a restaurant, or they want a picture of the line in the drive-thru at McDonald's. Whatever it is, it was crowdsourcing IRI Nielsen data, essentially, right? And that's a very successful model. You have other, so convenience is one, it's just convenient. You can gamify it. There's some really creative examples of how people have used gamification, making a competition in a game out of the exercise to where people actually fulfilled your need because they actually thought they were partaking in a game. This is an example where a cancer lab in the UK, this lady ran the lab and she didn't have enough money to pay to get all the cells diagnosed, so she made a first-person shooter game out of it. Someone coded a first-person shooter game. They put it on the web, it went viral, and you can see there they had 2 million images of tumor samples that were processed basically for free because they made it into a game. I've worked with companies where we took master data management, cleanup of master data, and we gamified it, put it out to the crowd, disguised, but it was like putting a crossword puzzle together. And if you can get the crowd to think they're playing a game, you can get work done for you as well. Another big thing is credibility and ego. A lot of these crowdsourcing designs are competition-based models where the winner gets recognized or the group of winners get recognized. You have a lot of examples where people compete because they want to get on this credible site it's like winning the Nobel Peace Prize, right? It's like being recognized among their peers. So people invest their time and effort to win a competition knowing that they're going to get applauded and recognized in their community. And there's a lot of good examples of that. Some people do it just for sense of passion and sense of community, really gravitate towards the cause. And then ultimately, it's about competitive spirit. You'll see a lot of crowdsourcing sites use competition to do it. So it's not always about the money to get those 7 to 8 billion people in the world, at least some portion of them, thinking about how to solve your problem. And keep in mind, when you crowdsource, you only need one shot on goal that goes in, even though you get rapid experimentation, right? Xprize, where I currently work there now, tries to use all of these elements. It's a nonprofit focused on taking on some of the world's grandest challenges. Xprize's model is, this is an area that government's incapable of solving, or big business doesn't have a profit motive to solve, but the world needs it solved. So we basically design an instrument that we put out to the crowd, and we use all those elements. We use prize purse, $15, $20, $30 million, but we also use the passion, the credibility, the ego, the competitive spirit to crowdsource solutions by getting this renaissance of entrepreneurs across the world that's all walking around with super tech in their pocket to solve some of the problems. Qualcomm Tricorder Xprize is one of the ones that's currently running. This is a $15 million prize to whoever can create a handheld device that can give you the same diagnostics of 54 health markers, essentially having a board of certified physicians in your pocket. This has been running for years. We're down to the top 7 finalists. By September, we'll be down to the top 3, and next year we'll give the award out. The Global Learning Xprize is another one doing the same thing, but teaching illiterate children how to read, where the crowd is competing on building software to teach kids, illiterate children that we have in Tanzania, where we have cohorts of villagers that we're going to use in the competition to try to educate them to a 3rd grade proficiency in reading, writing, math, and numeracy. And then at Xprize, Ray Kurzweil and others, we've got a great board and a community supporting that nonprofit mission. So what I want to share with you in the few minutes that remain is models in which you should be concerned about yourselves being somebody Ubering you in your model, right? I'm going to break down for you what you see if you start to dissect what's happening out there where these startups are becoming very successful because they're tying this combination of crowdsourcing together with the sharing economy and excess capacity. And I think particularly in manufacturing, and remember, I have been doing manufacturing my whole career. This is probably the biggest risk area if you make physical products. This is going to be your biggest risk area, and I'll try to break it down here. Excess capacity is alluding to physical things, but it also can be intellectual excess capacity. I'll talk about that in a moment. But physical things that are now excess capacity, they're not being used 24/7, okay? A couch that you have in your house that you don't use anymore, it's in the spare den. A bedroom, now that your kids are out of college and you got a couple bedrooms that are excess capacity, they're not being used to fully utilized. The automobile that you drive 1 hour out of 24 hours. This is all definitions of excess capacity that exist in the economy right now. Airbnb with the bedrooms, Uber with the car. Anyone want to admit they use couch surfing? Couchsurfing.com? It's a poor man's version of Airbnb. We got one person. If you have kids in college, you'll figure it out later when your kid tells you that they stayed the night on some stranger's couch because they use couchsurfing.com. I tell my son, I said, you can't stay, this is to Salim's point about like the generation gap. I tell my son, you can't stay in some stranger's house on their couch. It's like, Dad, I Googled him and he's like 3 people removed from you on LinkedIn, so you know him. I was like, okay, I guess. Touche, that works. So you look at models like Airbnb, right? Put this in perspective. This is an excess capacity, sharing economy, this whole notion of everyone's more inclined to share with each other, especially strangers. That model is working. When economies get depressed and incomes go down, people will share more. You'll see this be more of a phenomena that you see more and more of. And then you put crowdsourcing as the way to connect supply and demand. That's the trifecta. If you look at the data from 2012, this is when the leading hotel chain in business for almost a century had 610,000 hotel rooms. And then Airbnb, after just 4 years, which is a handful of people, surpassed the leading hotel chain. And how many hotels, I know we talked about this yesterday, how many hotels did Airbnb have? They had 0. Their marginal cost of supply is 0. Their marginal cost of demand is essentially 0. They don't even advertise. That's a hard model to compete with. That is an excess capacity model. There's excess capacity out there. People are sharing. We're going to use a sharing economy, and we're going to use crowdsourcing, the application, to connect supply and demand together. And that's what you saw happen there. This is happening everywhere now. You have parking spots in San Francisco and Los Angeles that you leave your house, you have a prime parking spot. Someone created an app, of course, to share the parking spots. It's excess capacity. If you go out into the ecosystems of entrepreneurs and innovation ecosystems around the world, I spent a lot of time in Tel Aviv. I was in Santiago, Chile last week. Silicon Valley, Brooklyn, New York. You talk to startups, this is everybody's playbook, is where is there excess capacity that we could put into this model? Think about when you're in traffic, and on your phone you got all this excess data that's not being used. Well, who used that? Who capitalized on all the excess data of coming off when you're in traffic? Waze used that, right? That was their model. Excess capacity, data that just wasn't being used. It was considered not even valuable. It was just excess that they turned into an asset by creating the model, by sharing it and getting crowd trafficking. So what you guys should start asking yourself is, where is your consumer's product or your customer's product, if you're an industrial manufacturer, where is it excess capacity for them? Because make no mistake about it, it's going to be put into this model. There are startups that are working this model. But think about that. If you make clothes or you sell clothes or anywhere in that supply chain, there's a lot of excess capacity of clothing out there. And it's a more absurd idea to think that the spare bedroom in your house is going to be used and shared than your clothing. There is technology that's going to make it uber friendly to scan yourself, to understand your dimensions, to be able to use artificial intelligence, machine vision to figure out, just by taking a picture of your closet, to start to inventory your closet, and then get an Uber car to bring it from your house to my house. Like, that will happen. There are startups that are going to do that, right? You have the same thing happening with the Internet of Things is going to put personal devices that will allow a sense of security on things that you make. So imagine if you have a lawnmower. How many of you use your lawnmower every day of the month? Nobody does. It's excess capacity. If you're in the business of making lawnmowers, you should consider the fact that you're going to get Ubered. Someone is going to create an app that makes it very user-friendly for anything that you have in your garage that you don't use all the time to start being shared in this sharing economy. And they're going to make models out of that. So if you manufacture anything or manufacture parts that go into any of these things, you should assume that you're going to be out of the mix. So the notion here is that think about your ecosystem and the things that you make. And it's not just consumer products. You got to think about industrial products too. You know, Caterpillar is a big sponsor here. If you look at what Caterpillar is doing, you give them a lot of kudos for this. A few years ago, they started to look into the sharing economy, excess capacity. And think about all the parts that you have as industrial manufacturers, equipment that's not being used all the time that could be used in the sharing economy. And you see that companies like Caterpillar have made moves now. EquipmentShare.com, Caterpillar buys a rental startup company. So this is happening. I'm going to conclude just by saying you guys are manufacturers, so I didn't focus a lot on the intellectual side, but intellectual capital is also being put into this. There's a lot of excess intellectual capital. So you could be a Google engineer by day, but on weekends, you're on these crowd sites using all that intellect to be part of the crowd model. So you see sites like Kaggle that use data scientists. I know a lot of you need data scientists. There's sites that do that. You have Topcoder to do developing and coding. You have Medcast for doctors. You have legal. Everything is going to this model, right? And you've got one of my favorite examples, Tongle. I don't have a lot of time to go into Tongle, but manufacturers are using Tongle to crowdsource what their advertising agency used to do by letting the creative community in a competition model try to come up with their best commercial. Colgate-Palmolive did this in about 3 years ago. They spent $17,000 as the prize money. Tongle put it out to 70,000 creative people. Colgate-Palmolive, it was for the brand Speed Stick. They only had to pay if they liked the winner. They picked a winner. They gave him 17 grand. The video was so good, it became their 2012 Super Bowl ad. It's the one they used in the Super Bowl for 17 grand. Now, is there really any surprise to that? Do the most creative people work for you? Do the smartest people work? They're somewhere in the crowd. This model they use to figure out how to get that wisdom of the crowd to solve something for them. Thank you very much, everybody.